Welcome to Devlog number 2. I got a lot done in the last 2 weeks, way more than I thought that I was going to. When I first started the last 2 week sprint, I had about 10 tasks that I wanted to complete, and I ended up getting 24 individual things done because I just kept adding and adding and adding as I ticked more and more things off. So thank you, social distancing, I guess. The first thing you'll probably notice, aside from the cube, and we will talk about the cube, is that the UI has evolved a lot. And by evolved, I mean it exists now, period, which it didn't before. So down here we've got this bottom bar, which shows the ship's status and posture. And I know that I complained about the bottom bar in the old UI in the previous video, but what I was complaining about was that it was what you issued orders through. So you'd come down here, you'd find the order you wanted to issue, and then you'd click in here for whatever you needed to do. But now this just shows the status of the ship, which will happen eventually, and then some posture settings, which I'll talk about later, rather than you issue orders through the radial menu now, so you don't have to take your eyes off the screen. And then over here we've got the list of ships that are in my fleet, and they've got numbers, so I can press a number on the keyboard to select it, or I can double tap it to focus on it, and it shows the identity of the ship, it shows what it's currently doing, so right now they're holding position, and there's a couple other icons that I am not really showing right now, but they're things like, is the ship firing? Is it being targeted? Is it receiving hits? Is it on fire? That kind of stuff. And then this colored silhouette will show basically a gradient color of what the status of the ship is in general. One hard and fast design rule for this game that I will not deviate from is that there will be no health bars for ships, because I don't like the idea that when the hit points reach 0, the ship just suffers this spontaneous existence failure. I think it's very, very silly. So I'm going to 100% avoid that. So this will just show like what the overall condition of all the modules on the ship are. And then below that we've got an indicator for what the status of the crew is. So that goes from calm to heightened to rattled to panicked. And a panicked crew will respond to orders more slowly, they'll take less accurate shots, things like that. I also spent a lot of time, when I wasn't fighting with Unity's awful UI system, working on movement. So you'll notice that I've only ever selected one ship. I can't bandbox anything, I can't shift-click multiple units, I can only have one selected, and that's a conscious decision. It's not that I haven't implemented that yet, because there's enough micromanagement for the ships planned that I don't think it makes sense to be able to issue orders to a broad group of ships at a time. But still, moving your fleet around is going to be a pain if you can only select one ship at a time. So how do we accomplish that? Well, the same way as in the real world, which is with formations. So I'm going to tell this ship to form up with this one, and so I can set a position relative to the guide ship, that's the ship in the center, and it will move into position on the formation. And so when I start moving this ship over this way, this one will maintain its position relative. Now, the really cool thing about the formations is that the guide is aware of the position of its escorts relative to it. So when I issue a formation order for this ship, you'll notice this one starts to slow down. It's setting its speed to 50% of the max speed of the ship that's fallen behind so that it can catch up. And so when that ship finally gets into its target position, this one will speed back up to its normal max speed. Now, I want to point out, because I think it's really cool, that the movement of the ships is actually physical. It's not some hacky, the ships are stepping towards the position every frame. The ships are actually applying thrust based on where they need to go. So there's a couple factors in that. They're thrusting towards their target, but there's also this ideal course that they want to follow. So for example, in the case of the escort, it's established position in the formation towards the target, and it's trying to keep itself on that ideal course, and it's going to thrust towards it. And then there's also something interesting that I found while I was implementing this, that if you are thrusting towards the line and you're not perfect about it, you'll end up with this extra component of velocity that you can't correct for, and so it kind of produces this interesting spiral around the track that it's trying to travel down. So I did end up coming up with a thrust vector that counteracts that, so it sits nicely on its intended course now, but it was an interesting effect, although it was kind of dumb, which is why the ships don't do it anymore. Now, in terms of other movement, actually, I'm going to slow these guys down first, because that ship is set to move very slowly. Right now, the CPU opponent is, it's literally just 5 lines of code to give a movement order to this ship here, so that it's a more interesting target to shoot at. But anyway, so this ship over here, another thing I implemented is obstacle avoidance. So this cube is actually my stand-in asteroid. So when I set a movement through this asteroid, the ship as it travels is casting a sphere out ahead to see if there are any obstacles in its way. And when it finds one, it's going to start ray casting in a spiral pattern. And as those rays hit a target, they exert an influence on the thrust vector for the ship. So the reason it's a spiral is because you can imagine a situation where if you were driving straight at the obstacle and you were casting in a grid, the rays may cancel out because they're all seeing the same thing. And so with the spiral pattern, each ray exerts an influence on the thrust vector based on how far away from, so the angle away from the center and the distance to the obstacle that it's finding. And so closer obstacles exert more influence, for example. Now and so what that results in is basically it's a way to find our way around obstacles in 3D space. So let's go back over to our formation here. I also messed around with the sensors a lot. So the UI has changed, first of all. So I have these icons now instead of the brackets. I think brackets are kind of like a really standard sci-fi trope for what radar contacts look like. And I didn't think it made sense in this context. In like a flight sim, it makes sense that you'd want to know exactly what the size of the thing in your vision is. But in a strategy game, you're really more interested in where it is in specific rather than how big it is, because a lot of the time you're going to be zoomed out. And this is not as far as this will zoom. In the sensor's view, you'll have a much more bigger blown up view. Now you'll see that that contact just disappeared, and that's because this has moved out of range of the radar on this ship, but these ones are still tracking it. So the difference in the icons is that this is where I know the specific position, and this is an inaccurate track because I've just found it with a search radar. Now anything that I own is always going to show up on the HUD, because it was a little silly that you'd only know where your ships were if you had one selected, which is the way it used to be. Now, I also improved the underlying code structure of the sensor system to give me a couple benefits. One of them is that tracks now age off, so when that contact disappeared before from the pity of Olympia, any guns that were on that ship that were firing at it would now have that track be marked as expired, and they would stop shooting at it. Because previously they would just keep shooting at that old track, that useless track that wasn't moving, because they didn't know that it was old. And also, I made it so that the ships can now contribute multiple sensors tracking the same target. So right now, each of these has a unique sensor context. They're all sharing the same number just because I made it that way for playability reasons. But each one of these has its own track of this target. In the future, these sensors should be networked so that if this one had its radars off and these two didn't, this one could still see this radar track because it was being fed that track by the other ships. Maybe you want to hide a ship by not having its radars on because it's a good way to get found, for example. So that's a technique you can use. I think that goes more to the electronic warfare future aspects of the game that I'm really interested in getting into later. And now, finally, I did a bunch of weapon updates. So now we are capable of shooting at a radar track. So we can pull up our turrets, search by track, and we can target the guns on that, and they will turn to it, and they will start firing at it. And so the radars are showing not just the position, but they're also keeping track of the velocity. So the guns know how fast their muzzle velocity is, the flight time or distance to target. They can gauge the flight time. They know the velocity of the target, and so they can lead it adequately. Now, once there are fire control radars implemented in the game, this will become a lock icon. Once you choose to lock the target using this button right here, but they will not lock automatically, and you can really only have one target locked at a time from a ship. But that just gives you more updated position and targeting data so that you can get more accurate shots, because I want to be clear that this is definitely not the kind of engagement range that this game is meant to be played at. It's just very easy to test things at this distance, but usually engagement ranges would be more like at the minimum to the distance of where that ship over there is, beyond visual range most of the time, especially when it comes to missiles. And speaking of missiles, I did some work on those, so they fly now, and they have some pretty cool logic built into them. So let's select a missile, and my favorite thing to do is watch them fly down, because when you fire a missile down, they have avoidance logic built into them. So this one will fly out, flip over top of the hull. When it's cleared it, it will light its engine and start flying down towards a target, which I think looks awesome. And so what these do is you can fire out a bunch of them at a time, and so they will all pop out one at a time, angle towards their target. They all have thrusters on them, and they will start flying towards that target. Now, one thing that I really want when it comes to the missiles is that I want to I'm going to stop this guy from firing now, which you can cancel orders now, so that's a big improvement. One thing I really want to stress about missiles is that my vision for missiles in this game is that I really hate, don't like is too mild, I think. I really hate in video games or media in general when missiles are just swarming all over the place. When the Macross Missile Massacre is the meme, right? What I want missiles to be like in this is that you can't, they're a very powerful, very limited, and very valuable resource to you, and you need to be economical with how you use them. So this ship has 16 missiles when I started, and now I have 11. That's all the missiles that I get for the entire length of the game, or for the entire duration of this match. And I need to make sure that I use them wisely, because a ship of this size getting hit by one of these missiles, if you get hit by like maybe 2 or 3, that ship should be completely incapacitated or crippled by those hits. So I definitely want to make sure that A, you don't get a lot of missiles, so that you have to be economical with them, and B, they're powerful and also have counters in the form of point defenses, which are not implemented yet. But when they are, you should expect a formation like this that has some point defenses on it. It should take maybe 10 missiles in order, you should have to fire 10 missiles at this in order to penetrate those defenses and get a hit, which is why, so you have a limited number of missiles, they're going to get shot down on the way in or decoyed, but when they hit, they're going to do a lot of damage, is the basic idea for how missiles should work in this game. So the last 2 weeks I spent working on all this stuff. I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do for the next sprint, and it was kind of a contest between whether I wanted to do damage implementation, so more stuff on weapons, how do ships take damage, how do modules take damage, that kind of stuff, versus implementing the start of multiplayer. And the reason I had to even consider that is because multiplayer, for the uninitiated, multiplayer is not actually just this extra bonus feature that you can throw onto your game. If you don't design the core systems with that in mind from the beginning, basically what you have to do when you want to put multiplayer in is you need to rip out all the guts and put the multiplayer supporting code in its place, and that's a lot of effort, and I really don't want to have to do that later on. So I'm starting to get to the point where a lot of the core systems are starting to solidify, and so if I don't start implementing the basics of multiplayer now and know what the architecture that's going to look like, I'm basically screwing myself over for the future. So I'm thinking that the next 2 weeks I'm really going to spend getting my multiplayer architecture done, or at least started, so that I know what I want to do from there. So that's what I've done over the last 2 weeks. I hope that you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.